The air of change is often silent before it becomes thunderous. At times, it brews slowly in whispers of discontent, in breadlines stretching too long, in voices muffled under the weight of injustice. And then, suddenly, it erupts into cries that shake the foundations of empires, bringing palaces down to the ground and rewriting the story of nations forever. Few moments in history capture this eruption as powerfully as the French Revolution, a tidal wave of anger, hope, blood, and transformation that began in 1789. It was a revolution that redefined the meaning of freedom, equality, and citizenship, and its echoes still shape our world today. Hello, and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. To understand the French Revolution, we must first step back into the world of 18th century France. At first glance, it was a dazzling kingdom, a jewel of culture, art, and power. Paris was the beating heart of Europe's intellectual and artistic life, the home of philosophers, salons, and sparkling fashion. The grandeur of Versailles reflected not only the wealth of the monarchy, but also the belief that France was destined to lead the world in refinement and strength. Yet beneath the gilded feelings and endless gardens of Versailles, a crisis festered. France was a nation divided, rigidly, formally, and brutally, into three estates. The first estate, the clergy, held immense wealth and influence, exempt from many taxes, and revered as moral guides. The second estate, the nobility, owned vast lands and enjoyed privileges by birth, often free from burdens that fell heavily on others. And then there was the third estate, everyone else. From merchants to peasants, from artisans to laborers, the third estate made up about 98% of the population. They carried the weight of taxation, endured the uncertainty of harvests, and yet were systematically denied equal political voice. By the late 1780s, the burden was unbearable. Years of costly wars, including France's critical support of the American Revolution, had drained the treasury. The glittering court of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette consumed vast wealth, while common people struggled to buy bread. Inflation surged, and in villages and towns, hunger grew sharper each day. The Enlightenment, too, was fueling the fire. Ideas of liberty, equality, and reason, spread by thinkers like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu, circulated in pamphlets and coffeehouses, challenging old hierarchies. A storm was gathering. King Louis XVI, though not an unkind man, was indecisive and ill-equipped to handle the crisis. His Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, became a symbol of extravagance and disconnection, whether fairly or unfairly. Her supposed words, "let them eat cake," though likely never uttered, captured the people's rage toward a monarchy blind to suffering. Desperate to fix the finances, Louis summoned the Estates General in 1789, a body that had not met in over 170 years. He hoped for solutions, but instead, he unleashed revolution. When the Estates General convened, the old divisions were immediately clear. Each estate traditionally had one vote, meaning the clergy and nobility could outvote the commoners 2-1, even though the third estate represented the vast majority of the nation. Frustrated and determined, the third estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the people of France. They vowed not to separate until they had written a new constitution. This defiant oath, taken in a humble indoor tennis court, became one of the revolution's first great moments, the tennis court oath. Tensions soon escalated from debate to violence. In Paris, fears of a royal crackdown gripped the streets. On July 14, 1789, the people stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison that symbolized royal tyranny. Though it held few prisoners, its fall became a turning point. The Bastille's capture was not just a military action, it was a statement, a declaration that the people would no longer bow to absolute power. news of the Bastille spread like wildfire, igniting uprisings across France. The countryside erupted in what became known as the Great Fear. Peasants, driven by hunger and rumor, attacked manor houses, destroying feudal records that tied them to centuries of obligation. The revolution was no longer confined to Paris. It was spreading through fields and villages, shaking the very structure of feudal society. In response, the National Assembly moved to abolish feudal privileges, tearing down centuries of inequality in one dramatic night. By 1791, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen had been proclaimed. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and America's Declaration of Independence, it asserted liberty, equality, and fraternity as the foundation of a new France. Yet the monarchy still existed, now under a constitutional framework. Louis XVI, however, could not reconcile himself to this diminished role. In a fateful miscalculation, he attempted to flee France in disguise, only to be captured in Varennes. His escape shattered the fragile trust between king and people, painting him as a traitor to the revolution. Meanwhile, factions within the revolution grew more divided. Moderate voices called for gradual reform, while radicals pushed for sweeping change. The Jacobins, a radical political club, gained influence, demanding the complete abolition of the monarchy. On the streets, revolutionary fervor deepened. The sans-culottes, the working-class militants of Paris, demanded bread, equality, and justice, pressuring leaders to act more decisively. By 1792, the revolution entered a new, more radical phase. Foreign powers, alarmed by the upheaval in France, formed coalitions to crush the revolution before it spread. Austria and Prussia threatened invasion to restore the king's power. In Paris, paranoia and rage exploded. Crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace, imprisoning the royal family. Soon after, in September, mobs attacked prisons, slaughtering suspect counter-revolutionaries in brutal massacres. Blood now ran in the name of liberty. The monarchy was abolished, and France was declared a republic. King Louis XVI was placed on trial not as a monarch, but as a citizen accused of betraying his nation. In January 1793, he was executed by guillotine, followed by Marie Antoinette later that year. Their deaths symbolized the irreversible break with the old order, but they also opened the door to a period of terror. The revolution had unleashed forces difficult to control. External wars raged against powerful enemies, while internal conflicts grew between revolutionaries themselves. The radical Jacobins, led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, seized dominance, declaring that to protect the revolution, enemies within must be eliminated. Thus began the Reign of Terror, where thousands were executed under suspicion of treason, nobles, clergy, and even former revolutionaries. The guillotine became the revolution's grim emblem, standing in Paris squares as a symbol of justice and fear. Robespierre believed in virtue through terror, arguing that only by purging corruption could the revolution survive. But the excesses of this period horrified many. Even as it defended liberty, the revolution devoured its own children. Leaders turned against one another, and the same blade that had ended monarchy soon ended the lives of radical voices. Eventually, Robespierre himself was executed in 1794, ending the terror but leaving France scarred. In the aftermath, a new government, the Directory, attempted to stabilize the nation. It was a system marked by corruption, inefficiency, and constant struggle. Yet within this turbulence, a new figure began to rise, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte. His victories on the battlefield captured public imagination, and in 1799 he would seize power, marking the revolution's end and the dawn of a new empire. But the French Revolution was more than its chaos and bloodshed. It was a profound transformation of society and politics. It challenged the divine right of kings, declared the equality of men, and planted seeds of nationalism and democracy across Europe. Though its ideals were often betrayed in practice, its legacy reshaped the world. It inspired uprisings, revolutions, and reform movements for centuries to come. And behind the grand events were countless untold stories, the struggles of peasants who fought for land, women who marched on Versailles demanding bread, intellectuals who risked their lives for ideas, and soldiers who fought under the banner of liberty. The revolution, though born in hope, quickly revealed how fragile liberty could be when tested by fear, war, and hunger. By 1793, France was engulfed in chaos. The execution of Louis XVI had shocked Europe, convincing monarchies everywhere that their own thrones were now in danger. Britain, Spain, Austria, and Prussia formed coalitions to crush the Revolutionary Republic before it became a contagion. The French state, already unstable, faced enemies at its borders and rebellion within its own provinces. One of the fiercest internal revolts came from the Vendée region, where peasants and royalists resisted conscription and the assault on the Catholic Church. In Paris, the National Convention, dominated by the radical Jacobins, declared that survival required absolute unity. Liberty and equality were no longer abstract ideals; they had to be defended with blood. Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras, rose as one of the revolution's most uncompromising voices. Known as the Incorruptible, he embodied the Jacobin belief that virtue could only be preserved by eliminating corruption and counter-revolution. Together with Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat, he turned revolutionary passion into a weapon of state. The Committee of Public Safety, established to guide the war effort, became the true engine of government. It oversaw not just military campaigns, but also the prosecution of those deemed enemies of the revolution. Suspicion became a currency, and accusations could mean death. The guillotine, once a symbol of justice, became a symbol of fear. Ordinary citizens were caught in the storm. Neighbors denounced one another, sometimes out of genuine suspicion, sometimes to settle personal scores. Former allies fell victim to the same revolution they had once served. Danton, once a firebrand of the uprising, was executed for being too moderate. Hebert, a radical journalist who had called for even more extreme measures, was also sent to the guillotine. The revolution consumed not only the aristocracy, but its own architects. In the streets, the sans-culottes demanded bread and punishment for hoarders. Their voice, loud and forceful, pushed the convention toward harsher policies. To them, the revolution was not just about lofty ideals, but about survival, about feeding their families and asserting dignity against centuries of oppression. They pressured leaders to maintain price controls, enforce rationing, and strike down hoarders who profited while the poor starved. Outside France, the revolutionary armies fought not only for defense, but also to spread revolutionary ideals. Soldiers marched under banners of liberty, often bringing radical reforms into occupied territories. They abolished feudal privileges, proclaimed equality, and planted seeds of change across Europe. Yet these ideals often came with heavy costs: plunder, forced conscription, and resentment. What had begun as a domestic upheaval was now transforming into a European-wide struggle. Robespierre, despite his reputation for incorruptibility, began to embody the contradictions of the revolution. He championed universal male suffrage, education for all, and the abolition of slavery in French colonies, measures that reflected deep humanitarian ideals. Yet he also oversaw a regime where dissent was silenced by death. In the name of freedom, terror reigned. The Festival of the Supreme Being in 1794, an elaborate public ceremony, revealed both Robespierre's vision and his growing isolation. He sought to replace traditional religion with a civic faith centered on reason and virtue. But many saw in this spectacle a dangerous arrogance, a leader who believed himself almost divine. Within weeks, opposition grew. The same convention that once cheered him turned against him. On July 27th, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre was arrested. The next day, he was guillotined, his fall marking the end of the Reign of Terror. France exhaled in relief, but the revolution was far from over. The Thermidorian reaction sought to roll back some of the radical excesses. Price controls were lifted, and political clubs were shut down. But with these changes came new hardships.
Inflation soared once again, and the poor, who had looked to the revolution for relief, found themselves betrayed. The revolution that had promised bread now offered little more than instability. In 1795, a new constitution created the Directory, a 5-member executive body intended to prevent dictatorship. It was designed to balance power, but in practice, it was riddled with corruption and inefficiency. The Directory struggled to control a restless nation, fighting wars abroad while facing discontent at home. It lacked legitimacy, and its leaders were often seen as opportunists rather than visionaries. Yet, amid this instability, the revolution's broader transformations could not be undone. Feudalism had been abolished, aristocratic privilege dismantled, and the principle of citizenship redefined. Ideas once confined to philosophers' books now had the force of law. Even women, though denied political rights, asserted their voices through activism, writing, and marches. Figures like Olympe de Gouges, who penned the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, challenged the revolution to live up to its ideals, though she too paid with her life. Across Europe, the shockwaves continued. Monarchs watched nervously as revolutionary armies carried not only muskets, but ideas. In places like the Netherlands, Italy, and even parts of Germany, French victories toppled old regimes. To some, the revolution became a beacon of liberation, to others, a warning of chaos. In this climate of uncertainty, one figure began to emerge as a savior in the eyes of many: Napoleon Bonaparte. A brilliant young general from Corsica, Napoleon rose to fame through his campaigns in Italy, where his daring strategies and unbroken string of victories captured public imagination. He was seen as the embodiment of revolutionary energy, a man of talent, not birth, who had risen through merit rather than privilege. But Napoleon was not merely a soldier. He was also a shrewd politician, sensing the weaknesses of the Directory. In 1799, he staged the coup of 18 Brumaire, overthrowing the government and establishing the consulate. France, exhausted by a decade of turmoil, embraced him as a stabilizer. The revolution had ended not with a republic of equal citizens, but with the rise of an emperor. Still, the French Revolution's legacy endured. Its contradictions were glaring. It proclaimed universal rights, yet excluded women. It colonized peoples. It spoke of liberty, yet justified terror. It destroyed monarchy, yet paved the way for empire. But its achievements were undeniable. It dismantled the feudal order, redefined citizenship, and inspired movements around the world. From Latin America's independence struggles to Europe's later revolutions of 1848, the cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity echoed across borders. Even in modern times, the French Revolution remains a touchstone for debates about justice, democracy, and the power of ordinary people to change history. Yet, to truly grasp the revolution, we must look not only at its leaders, but also at its people. The peasants who burned records of feudal dues, the women who marched on Versailles demanding bread, the soldiers who carried ideals across Europe, the citizens who both built and dismantled regimes in the streets of Paris. Their stories remind us that revolutions are never just about ideals. They are about lives lived in struggle, hope, and sacrifice. When we walk the streets of Paris today, the echoes of that time remain. The Place de la Concorde, once the site of the guillotine, now stands as a symbol of peace. The Louvre, transformed during the Revolution into a museum for the people, still reflects that spirit of public ownership of culture. And the French tricolor, born of revolutionary struggle, still flies as a testament to a nation remade in fire. The French Revolution was not a simple story of victory or defeat. It was a storm, violent, contradictory, yet transformative. It left scars, but also created a vision of a world where people, not kings, held sovereignty. That vision, fragile and incomplete as it was, continues to challenge us today.
The revolution's journey after the fall of Robespierre was a study in contradictions, an uneasy balance between hope for stability and the lingering echoes of fear. France had experienced the extremes of monarchy, radical democracy, and terror, and by 1795, the Thermidorian reaction sought to carve out a middle path, But finding equilibrium in a nation so deeply divided was nearly impossible. The Thermidorians attempted to moderate the revolution, loosening the grip of radicalism and restoring a degree of social order. They reopened churches, though the state remained officially secular, and rolled back many of the price controls that had supported the poor. On the surface, this seemed like a step toward normalcy, yet the consequences were devastating. As price controls lifted, food costs soared. Bread, the lifeline of the French people, once again became scarce for those at the bottom of society. Riots broke out, and the dream of liberty, equality, and fraternity seemed increasingly hollow to those struggling to survive. The new Constitution of 1795 created the Directory, a system meant to avoid the concentration of power that had fueled both monarchy and terror. Executive power was shared among 5 directors, while legislative authority was divided into 2 councils. This arrangement was designed to prevent tyranny, but in practice it paralyzed decisive leadership. Each branch distrusted the other, and constant factional struggles undermined stability. Meanwhile, the revolution's enemies had not disappeared. Royalists, emboldened by the king's execution, conspired to restore the monarchy. On the opposite side, radical Jacobins longed to revive the fervor of 1793. The Directory found itself squeezed between royalist insurgencies and Jacobin conspiracies, relying increasingly on the army to maintain control. It was in this climate that a young general began to rise, Napoleon Bonaparte. His military brilliance was evident in the Italian campaign of 1796, where his daring maneuvers brought stunning victories against Austrian forces. His campaigns not only secured French territory, but also spread revolutionary ideals abroad. He dismantled old feudal structures in Italy, inspiring reforms, while simultaneously establishing French dominance. His fame skyrocketed, and in the eyes of many, he became the revolution's brightest star. But while Napoleon triumphed abroad, the Directory floundered at home. Corruption was rampant, with directors enriching themselves while citizens despaired. Inflation eroded savings, and economic crises multiplied. Public faith in the government collapsed. The revolution, once envisioned as a rebirth of justice, seemed trapped in endless cycles of betrayal and instability. Still, in these years of turmoil, some of the revolution's most enduring reforms took root. The abolition of feudal dues remained in effect, fundamentally altering rural life. Land ownership shifted dramatically as lands confiscated from nobles and the church were sold, often to peasants and middle-class citizens. This redistribution changed the social landscape of France forever, weakening the aristocracy and empowering a new class of landowners. Education, too, began to expand. Revolutionary leaders had long believed that citizenship required knowledge, and though progress was uneven, schools and civic institutions grew. The revolution's message that ordinary people had the capacity and right to shape their own future continued to inspire, even when betrayed by leaders. Yet disillusionment was widespread. The revolution had promised equality, but delivered new hierarchies. It had preached liberty, but unleashed terror. Women, who had marched on Versailles and filled revolutionary clubs, found themselves silenced once more. The Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, once vibrant, was shut down. Leaders argued that women's political activity threatened order, pushing them back into the private sphere. Writers like Olympe de Gouges, who demanded equality in her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, had been executed years earlier, and her voice remained a haunting reminder of opportunities lost. Beyond Paris, the revolution had profound consequences in the colonies. The Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, was the jewel of French imperial wealth, built on the labor of enslaved Africans. Inspired by revolutionary ideals, enslaved people rose in rebellion in 1791. Leaders like Toussaint Louverture transformed the uprising into the most successful slave revolt in history. By 1794, under Jacobin leadership, the French government abolished slavery in all its colonies, a radical step unmatched by most nations at the time. Yet this emancipation was fragile. While it remained law, economic interests and political calculations often undermined its spirit.
Still, the Haitian Revolution continued, culminating in Haiti's independence in 1804. This was a revolution within a revolution, proving that the call for liberty and equality extended far beyond Europe. The French Revolution's ideals, though inconsistently applied, had lit fires across the Atlantic world. Back in France, the Directory's weakness grew more apparent with each passing year. Political purges, coups, and repression became routine. The legislature was manipulated, elections overturned, and opposition silenced. The dream of a stable republic seemed ever more distant. Yet amid this dysfunction, the army continued to deliver victories, and Napoleon's reputation only soared higher. In 1798, Napoleon launched an ambitious campaign in Egypt aimed at disrupting British trade routes and extending French influence. Though the military outcome was mixed, the expedition left a remarkable legacy. It brought scholars, scientists, and artists who documented ancient monuments, producing the Description de l'Egypte and discovering the Rosetta Stone, which would later unlock the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Napoleon was not just a general, but also a visionary who linked conquest with knowledge, war with science. By 1799, the Directory had lost all credibility. France longed for order, and many looked to Napoleon as the man who could deliver it. In November of that year, he staged the coup of 18 Brumaire, dissolving the Directory and establishing the consulate. The revolution's decade-long experiment with republicanism had ended, replaced by a new concentration of power in the hands of one man. Napoleon, however, did not present himself as a tyrant. He styled himself as the heir of the revolution, promising to preserve its achievements while bringing stability. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that enshrined equality before the law, property rights, and secular authority. Though it curtailed women's rights and centralized power, it became one of the revolution's most enduring legacies, influencing legal systems worldwide. Under Napoleon, France became a modern state, with reorganized administration, improved education, and economic reforms. But the revolution's ideals were both advanced and betrayed. The Republic had been replaced by dictatorship, soon to become empire. Liberty was narrowed, even as equality before the law was secured. The French Revolution, then, was both a triumph and a tragedy. It broke the chains of feudalism and declared the sovereignty of the people. It inspired movements across the globe and reshaped political thought forever. Yet it also unleashed terror, silenced dissent, and ended in authoritarianism. To understand its true impact, we must remember that revolutions are not clean narratives. They are storms, chaotic and contradictory. The French Revolution was not simply about heroes and villains, victories and defeats. It was about millions of ordinary lives, peasants who claimed land, workers who demanded bread, soldiers who carried ideals across Europe, women who dared to speak and were silenced. Its legacy is the tension between ideals and reality, between the promise of liberty and the compromises of power. And that tension is not confined to history books. It is alive in every society that wrestles with questions of equality, justice, and the voice of the people. When we think of the revolution today, we might picture the storming of the Bastille, the guillotine in the square, or the rise of Napoleon. But beyond these images lies a deeper truth, that history is made not only by kings and generals, by the courage, anger, and dreams of ordinary people who dared to demand a different world. And perhaps that is why the French Revolution continues to captivate us. It reminds us of the immense power that lies in collective action, of the dangers when ideals are consumed by fear, and of the possibility, fragile yet enduring, of remaking society from the ground up.
When Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in 1799, many wondered if the revolution had ended or simply taken on a new form. The ideals of 1789, liberty, equality, fraternity, still echoed in the streets of Paris and beyond, but the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The consulate, with Napoleon as first consul, concentrated power in a way that echoed the monarchy, yet it wore the cloak of revolutionary legitimacy. For a weary nation, exhausted by a decade of upheaval, this new order promised something priceless: stability. Napoleon understood that to secure his rule, he needed to balance continuity with change. He carefully framed himself not as a destroyer of the revolution, but as its protector. His government preserved many of the revolution's most important reforms: the abolition of feudalism, equality before the law, and meritocracy in government service. But at the same time, he dismantled the fragile republican institutions that had tried to embody popular sovereignty. France had exchanged the chaos of competing factions for the certainty of a single strong leader. One of Napoleon's most enduring contributions was the Napoleonic Code, introduced in 1804. This legal system codified many revolutionary principles, establishing a unified framework for civil law. It guaranteed equality before the law, safeguarded property rights, and reinforced secular authority by separating law from the church. For many French citizens, this was a tangible victory. No longer would privilege of birth dictate one's rights in court. Yet the code also revealed limitations. Women were denied legal equality, their rights subordinated to fathers and husbands. For all its progressive aspects, the code reinforced patriarchal norms, showing that the revolution's promise of equality had not yet reached every citizen. Napoleon also restructured the state itself. He created efficient administrative divisions, appointing prefects to oversee regions and standardizing systems of taxation. Education was reformed to train loyal citizens and competent officials, with a strong emphasis on discipline and national pride. The revolution had shattered the old order, but Napoleon gave the new France an enduring institutional framework that, in many respects, survives today. On the international stage, Napoleon sought to spread both French power and revolutionary ideals. His armies marched across Europe, dismantling feudal privileges, introducing legal reforms, and redrawing political boundaries. In Italy, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, the Napoleonic reforms modernized states and challenged monarchies. To many, the French armies brought liberation from outdated hierarchies. Yet to others, they brought only conquest and domination. The revolution's ideals were carried by bayonets, inseparable from empire. Meanwhile, the revolution's legacy in the colonies remained fraught. Though France had abolished slavery in 1794, Napoleon reinstated it in 1802, bowing to economic interests in the Caribbean. This betrayal fueled renewed resistance in Saint-Domingue, where Toussaint Louverture and his successors fought not only for emancipation but for independence. By 1804, Haiti declared itself a free republic, the first black nation born of a successful slave revolt. The Haitian Revolution stood as both an extension and a critique of the French Revolution, proof that liberty and equality could not be confined to Europe, but also a reminder of how often ideals faltered when confronted with economic power. Within France, Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, a gesture that seemed to mock the revolution's rejection of monarchy. Yet even as he placed the crown on his head in Notre Dame Cathedral, he claimed to embody the sovereignty of the people. It was not the church that gave him legitimacy, nor divine right, but his own authority, supposedly rooted in the will of the nation. This paradox defined the Napoleonic era: an emperor who proclaimed himself the child of the revolution, a dictator who spoke the language of liberty. The wars of the Napoleonic period reshaped Europe. Victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram expanded French influence to unprecedented levels. But as the empire grew, so did resistance. In Spain, guerrilla warfare tied down French armies in a brutal conflict that foreshadowed the empire's vulnerability. In Eastern Europe, the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 marked the beginning of Napoleon's decline. By 1814, coalitions of European powers forced his abdication, and though he returned briefly in 1815 during the 100 Days, his final defeat at Waterloo ended his reign. With Napoleon's fall, the question returned: what remained of the revolution? The Bourbon monarchy was restored, but it could not fully erase the changes of the previous quarter century. Feudalism was gone, legal equality enshrined, and the notion of citizenship permanently altered. The revolution had not achieved all it promised, but it had reshaped France and Europe forever.
The revolution's legacy, however, extended far beyond laws and institutions. It lived on in ideals and symbols, in the tricolor flag, in the national anthem La Marseillaise, in the concept of popular sovereignty. Across the world, reformers and revolutionaries drew inspiration from France's upheaval. In Latin America, leaders like Simón Bolívar looked to the French example as they fought for independence. In Europe, waves of revolution in 1830 and 1848 echoed the spirit of 1789. The revolution had become not just a French story, but a global one. Yet it was also a cautionary tale. The Reign of Terror exposed the dangers of unchecked power in the name of virtue. The rise of Napoleon revealed how revolutions could pave the way for authoritarianism, even when driven by ideals. The revolution demonstrated both the potential of people to demand change and the risks when fear and ambition distort that vision. For ordinary French citizens, the revolution had mixed outcomes. Peasants benefited from the abolition of feudal dues, securing land and greater independence. The middle classes, merchants, professionals, and bureaucrats rose in influence, shaping a new bourgeois society. Workers, however, often remained in precarious conditions, their hopes for economic justice frustrated by political elites. Women, whose activism had been so visible in 1789, found themselves marginalized, their political participation restricted for generations to come. Still, their presence in the revolution could not be erased from memory. The March of Women to Versailles in October 1789, demanding bread and confronting the monarchy directly, remained one of the revolution's most iconic moments. The writings of Olympe de Gouges and the activism of countless unnamed women continued to inspire later movements for gender equality. The revolution may not have fulfilled their demands, but it planted seeds that would grow in centuries ahead. The French Revolution also transformed the relationship between citizens and the state. Before 1789, people were subjects of a king. Afterward, they became citizens of a nation. This shift in identity was profound. Citizenship meant rights, but also responsibilities, taxation, military service, and participation in civic life. The revolution redefined what it meant to belong to a political community, a legacy that still shapes modern democracies. Culturally, the revolution left deep marks as well. Art, theater, and literature reflected the passions of the time. Revolutionary festivals, with their elaborate symbolism, attempted to replace religious traditions with civic rituals. Even fashion became politicized, as clothing signaled allegiance to revolutionary ideals. The very language of politics changed, with words like patrie, citoyen, and république gained new power. The memory of the revolution became contested territory in French history. Conservatives remembered it as a time of chaos and bloodshed. Radicals celebrated it as the dawn of liberty. Each generation interpreted it anew, shaping its meaning to suit contemporary struggles. Even today, debates about the revolution's legacy continue in France, reflecting the depth of its impact. What makes the French Revolution so compelling is not just its drama, the storming of the Bastille, the guillotine in the square, the rise and fall of Robespierre and Napoleon, but the questions it raised, questions that remain urgent. How far should people go to secure equality? Can liberty survive in times of crisis? Do revolutions inevitably devour themselves? In answering these questions, we find not only the story of France, but a mirror for all societies wrestling with injustice. The revolution reminds us that change is possible, that ordinary people can topple centuries-old structures. But it also warns us of the dangers when ideals are twisted by fear or ambition. As the 19th century began, France stood transformed. Its monarchy gone, its social hierarchy shattered, its laws remade, it had become a laboratory of modern politics. The revolution had unleashed forces that could not be contained, shaping not only France's destiny, but that of the modern world. And yet, at its heart, the revolution was a human story. It was about the hungry mother demanding bread for her children, the young soldier marching under a banner of liberty, the philosopher daring to imagine a world built on reason rather than tradition. It was about people, in all their courage and frailty, trying to build a better future.
By the time Napoleon's empire collapsed in 1815, the world had been irreversibly changed by the revolution that began in 1789. Though monarchies were restored in France and across Europe, the old order could never fully return. The revolution had exposed its fragility, dismantled its legitimacy, and shown that people, ordinary people, could claim sovereignty. The very idea of divine right had been permanently shaken. France, of course, would continue to wrestle with instability throughout the 19th century. The monarchy would return, only to fall again in 1830. Another revolution would come in 1848, followed by the rise of the Second Empire under Napoleon III. Yet through all these upheavals, the principles first declared in 1789 continued to resonate. Liberty, equality, fraternity, they remained unfinished promises, but they were promises that could not be silenced. To truly grasp the revolution's significance, one must look not only at its outcomes, but also at its imagination. For centuries, the social order had been presented as natural, unchangeable. Kings ruled by divine authority, nobles enjoyed privilege by birth, peasants labored under obligation. The revolution shattered this illusion. It declared that societies are made by people, and therefore can be remade by people. This was its most radical act, not simply the toppling of a king, but the assertion that no hierarchy is eternal. That assertion inspired both hope and fear. To those yearning for justice, it was a beacon. To those in power, it was a threat. In this way, the revolution became a global reference point, invoked by movements as diverse as abolitionists, nationalists, socialists, and Democrats. Its legacy was not a single path, but a spectrum of possibilities. Of course, the revolution also revealed the darker sides of transformation. The Reign of Terror showed how ideals could be consumed by paranoia and violence. The rise of Napoleon demonstrated how a revolution for liberty could end in dictatorship. These contradictions remind us that progress is rarely linear. Revolutions open doors, but they also unleash forces that can overwhelm their own intentions. Yet even these failures became part of the revolution's enduring lesson. They caution us against blind idealism, but they also insist that the pursuit of justice is worth the risk of imperfection. The revolution teaches not that change is easy, but that it is possible, and that possibility is powerful enough to alter the course of history. Looking closely, the revolution was not a single story, but many interwoven stories. It was the story of peasants burning records of feudal dues in the countryside, seizing a measure of freedom after centuries of servitude. It was the story of urban workers demanding bread, dignity, and a voice in politics, reshaping the very meaning of citizenship. It was the story of intellectuals debating Enlightenment ideas in cafes, transforming philosophy into action. It was the story of women who dared to march, to write, to demand equality, even when silenced by law and blade. And it was the story of enslaved people in the colonies who heard the revolution's words and claimed them, proving that liberty was not the privilege of Europe alone. Taken together, these stories form a mosaic, complex, contradictory, and unfinished. That is the essence of the French Revolution. It was never simply about toppling a throne. It was about redefining human possibility. Walking through Paris today, the traces of this past linger. The Place de la Bastille, where the prison once stood, now holds a column commemorating not monarchy, but the struggles of revolutionaries. The Pantheon, originally built as a church, became a temple to heroes of the nation, where figures like Voltaire and Rousseau rest. The French flag, the tricolor, born of revolution, still flies proudly, its colors representing a nation forged not by kings, but by its people. Even the language of modern politics carries the revolution's imprint. Words like citizen, republic, rights, and nation gained new force in those years, shaping discourse across continents. The revolution's documents, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the Napoleonic Code, remain landmarks in the history of human rights and law. Perhaps the revolution's most profound legacy is not any single institution or law, but its reminder that history is malleable. It showed that societies, no matter how entrenched their hierarchies, can be transformed when people demand it. It proved that injustice is not destiny, that authority can be challenged, that imagination and action together can change the world. And yet, it also left a sobering truth, that change is not without cost. The
The French Revolution was born in hope, but it lived in struggle and often in blood. It promised fraternity, but delivered suspicion. It preached equality, but often failed to practice it. It reminds us that revolutions are not pure. They are human, and therefore flawed. But they matter because they open paths that would otherwise remain closed. 2 centuries later, we still live in the shadow of 1789. Whenever people march for justice, whenever citizens demand equality, whenever societies wrestle with the balance of freedom and security, the echoes of the French Revolution resound. It is a story that belongs not only to France, but to the world, a reminder of what is possible and of the perils that accompany possibility. The French Revolution was not the end of history, nor the final word on liberty, but it was a beginning, a loud, chaotic, and unforgettable beginning. It was the sound of doors being forced open, of voices long silenced now demanding to be heard. It was a storm that tore down one world and gestured, imperfectly, toward another. And in that gesture lies its power. The French Revolution may not have fully delivered liberty, equality, or fraternity, but it proved that these ideals could move people to action, could inspire courage against impossible odds, could transform not just governments, but the very imagination of humanity. So when we look back on those tumultuous years, from the storming of the Bastille to the guillotine's shadow, from the marches of women to the rise of Napoleon, we are not only studying history. We are listening to a conversation that continues today, a conversation about who holds power, about what justice demands, about how far we are willing to go to build a world that honors human dignity. And perhaps that is why the French Revolution still grips us, still provokes us, still teaches us, because its story is, in truth, unfinished. Each generation writes its own chapter, inspired or cautioned by the lessons of 1789. The revolution's ideals remain alive, not as relics of the past, but as challenges for the present. The storm may have passed, but the questions remain. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.